Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're really delighted to be hosting a New Yorker writer, John Cassidy, who's here to talk about his sweeping, or as a Washington Post review called it, magisterial new book, Capitalism and Its Critics, a history from the Industrial Revolution to AI. As a journalist, John has specialized in covering economics and politics. He's been a staff writer at The New Yorker for 30 years and writes a regular column for the magazine called The Financial Page. His previous two books also have dealt with economic developments. .con in 2002 was about the dot-com bubble. And in 2009, he came out with How Markets Fail, about the housing bubble and credit bust. In his new book, John tackles capitalism itself, but not through the accounts of what he calls depersonalized forces, such as competition, technology, and profits, which is how the story is often told. Instead, John focuses on people who have criticized capitalism over the years, from the English Luddites who rebelled against early factory automation, to communists in Germany and Russia in the early 20th century, to today's degrowth movement. He cites familiar names, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes, Milton Friedman, Thomas Piketty, but he also includes a number of lesser-known thinkers and activists who've expressed various grievances about capitalism and promoted alternatives. You know, given the rising disaffection in recent years with the global capitalist system and Donald Trump's own ability to play on this discontent and try to reshape the rules, John's book is especially timely. As he mentions in the introduction, he initially envisioned writing a shortish history that would have begun with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but he realized that to properly understand the roots of capitalism's discontents, he needed to go back farther, about 250 years back, to a campaign against the East India Company by an employee named William Boltz, and write a longer book. Still, even at 518 pages, not counting the notes, the book is very lively and lucid and offers quite an original view of capitalism's development through a combination of intellectual history and biography. Now, in conversation with John was supposed to be tonight Jared Bernstein, who was a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, but turns out he's recovering from some surgery, so he couldn't make it. But John's going to do a great job going solo. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming John Cassidy.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming out. I'll just open my New Yorker bag, which has a not very funny cartoon on it, our prime content. Hopefully this book is prime content. Thanks very much for inviting me. Just a quick word about why Jared isn't here. He was very much hoping to be here, and he actually read the whole book and told me he really liked it. But he had some surgery last week, and his recovery period is nothing too serious, but his recovery period has been a bit longer than he thought, and he's not mobile yet. So he finally gave me the can't make it while I was on the Acela today at 4 o'clock. So I said, it's okay, Jared. I took down, we had a big conversation about it a few days ago, and I actually took down his questions he was going to ask me. So you are getting 2 for the price of 1 still. I will act as Jared and act as myself answering the questions, which I am a reporter. I've got my reporter's notebook. But anyway, before I get onto the self Q&A, or the virtual Jared Q&A, I just wanted to say a bit about where the book came from. And it's already mentioned that it sort of dates back to 2015, 2016, when Trump and Bernie Sanders were both running from the right, from the left, offering critiques of capitalism at the time, criticizing the centrists. Obviously, Bernie was making Hillary's life a misery, and Trump was demolishing the Republican Party as we'd known it for the last 50 years. So it seemed to me at that time that this wasn't just a sort of one-off political movement, that it reflected a big change. And there were opinion polls at the time also, which I also found very striking, which both transatlantic polls, not just in the US, but in the UK, sort of open-ended polls where you ask people what they think about various isms, capitalism, socialism, fascism, or whatever. And on that pecking order, capitalism came below socialism in some polls, especially among young people in the US and in the UK among the population as a whole. So it seemed to me that there was a sort of burgeoning crisis of legitimacy of the system, which I needed to address in some way. And it was just sort of in my bailiwick, because my two previous books have been about sort of catastrophic capitalist incidents. The first one being the dot-com boom and bust, and the second one being the great financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, which I somehow managed to turn into a sort of history in economics. So I didn't want to rewrite those books, but I thought that there is a sort of broader subject here. What's the basis of the crisis capitalism is facing? Where did it come from? Is it like anything in the past? And I originally, as has been said, I thought I'd take it back to the end of the Cold War and the sort of emergence of George Bush's New World Order, which I actually reported on at the time, George H.W. Bush's. I don't know if you all remember that. It didn't last very long, but there was a New World Order for a few weeks. I was a White House correspondent at the time for the London Times. So, but the more I looked into the subject, the more it became obvious to me that a lot of the key issues, things like globalization, inequality, worker exploitation, sort of anomie, general discontent, not global warming, I'll get to that in a while, that's obviously something new, or climate change. But a lot of the problems which financial instability and bankers needing to be bailed out go back a lot further than 1988 or the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized they go back actually to the start of the sort of industrial capitalist system, and even before it, in some cases, back into mercantile capitalism. So I sort of started working backwards. I thought, oh, maybe I'll start with the post-war era with Keynes and the construction of the sort of Keynesian social democracy on both sides of the Atlantic, and tell the story of how that rose and how that collapsed, and then got into neoliberalism. I thought, well, but then you have to explain the Great Depression, and I sort of started working backwards. And eventually I figured, look, just let's go for the whole thing. Let's start at the beginning, such as there is a beginning, and take it until now. So then the question arises, well, where is the beginning? Because, you go back to Jesus running saying the rich people in the temple, running the rich people out of the temple, and saying it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to pass through the eye of the needle, which when I was a kid in a Catholic school, I always thought was the eye of a little needle. Turns out the needle was a sort of a little narrow passageway in the temple in Jerusalem, which you could get through, but it was difficult. But anyway, the point's the same. People have been criticizing profit motive and capitalism since the year dot. Sure, if we went back to prehistoric times, there was probably some local who they didn't like either, some local trader. So I decided I had to draw a line somewhere, and I thought the place to start is where I'm from, Northern England, in sort of 1770, and the rise of industrial capitalism with the cotton textiles industry. If you read academic books on economic history, they often start there with the Industrial Revolution, dating it to Richard Arkwright and the first mechanized factory in Derbyshire, which does appear in the book. But again, that's a bit of a false start. So I wanted to be clear that there were pre-existing forms of capitalism that industrial capitalism was built on. It didn't come out of nothing. It came out of, it emerged from mercantile capitalism, which in itself was a global system. and had major international corporations, multinational corporations like the East India Company, which so it had globalization. The East India Company and the Dutch East India Company and the Africa Company, a lot of companies. The Africa Company was the one which was originally involved in the triangular slave trade, which itself was a global enterprise. So you've got globalization, and you have corporations. They were real corporations, and it turned out when I started studying that in 1772 we even had a bailout. There was the East India Company. How do you lose money so much when you've got a monopoly on all the trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, and get yourself in that sort of trouble? It's a bit like, how did Donald Trump bankrupt 4 casinos? You know, you think there's a license to print money, right? The East India Company was also a license to print money, but they had to finance armies because they had their own armies in India, especially, and Indonesia. And anyway, they got in a lot of trouble. They went bust, effectively. And it turned out that they were lucky in that a lot of the MPs in Parliament, which at the time was basically an oligarchic parliament, don't think of it as a modern democratic system. It wasn't at all. It was basically an aristocratic oligarchy. And a lot of the aristocrats were invested in the East India Company. So they didn't want to see it go bust either. So in 1772, there was an actual bailout, very similar to what happened in 2008. And there was a bit of a public blowback because some of the MPs weren't invested in the East India Company, so they didn't support it. And some of the landowners weren't invested either, and the way things worked, that was where the taxes came from. So there was a sort of mini 2008 and a mini revolt, and my first critic, William Boltz, who I think is sort of unknown until now, relatively unknown anyway, he actually published a book. He was a villain himself, so he was a sort of unreliable narrator, which makes him doubly interesting. He'd been a trader in India himself. The way the East India Company worked, the company itself did a lot of trading. They basically bought goods from Indian cotton, but lots of saltpeter, which they made gunpowder from, all sorts of fruits and nuts from Indonesia and Malaysia, and they brought them back to England and then exported them again. And they had a monopoly, so they could charge high prices, and they also had a monopoly of the shipping lanes, so they basically were vertically integrated, and as I said, a very lucrative job. But if you went to work for the East India Company, as a lot of minor aristocrats did, the British system is primogeniture. So if you were the third son of, the Duke of Norfolk, tough luck, you got nothing. Where your big brother, inherited sort of 50,000 acres. So what did you do? A lot of the minor aristocrats went to work for the East India Company, and they go over to India, and as well as working for the company, you're allowed to work for yourself on the side and build up your own fortune. So there was a lot of villainy and crookery going on there. And William Boltz was one of these guys, and he was such a crook that the company in London, he thought they were giving him a bad name, so they cracked down on him and fired him and brought him back to London. Then when the company got in trouble, he wrote a tell-all about the sort of evils of the East India Company and how they were exploiting the natives where they lived and exploiting the government and exploiting everybody. And it didn't become a bestseller. It wasn't like The Big Short, but it did become a big talking point in Westminster, and there was a sort of rebellion against the bailout, and it became a huge political issue. So I thought, that's my starting point. And that's where the book starts in, as I said, the late 1760s. It's also excellent because Adam Smith, who appears in the book as a critic of capitalism, wrote Wealth of Nations in 1776. Now you're saying, why the hell is Adam Smith in a book about critics of capitalism? I remember when I was in Washington in the late 80s and early 90s, all the right-wingers used to walk around with their Adam Smith badges. I don't know if they still do, but old school republicanism, I think there was an Adam Smith Institute in Washington. I don't know if there still is, but all the institutes, all the think tanks, obviously, he was the patron saint of free market capitalism then. But in his own day, Smith was actually a big critic of monopoly capitalism as represented by the East India Company and other monopolies. The system is very, very timely because these companies not only were monopolies sort of ripping off the producers and the consumers who they were overcharging, but they were also, they were based on protectionism. There was massive tariffs. So it was a protectionist system. That's what mercantilism is. And Trump Trump's trying to resurrect it, of course. Smith was a big critic of that. He said it's inefficient. We could get all these goods at half the price if we got rid of all the tariffs and got rid of all the trade restrictions and the restrictions on transport. And he says in The Wealth of Nations, he wrote the book basically as a manifesto against mercantile capitalism. So in this book, he's the second critic of capitalism, even though in a way, he was the sort of prophet of free market capitalism as was to come, as created in Britain in the sort of early 19th century when there weren't really big monopolies then. It still was largely a free market, and the British promoted free trade around the world, largely in their own interest because they were the low-cost producer. If you're a low-cost producer, it's always in your interest to be in favor of free trade. That's why the US was in favor of it post-1945, because we were the low-cost producer. I'm British and American, so I can say two we's. We were the low-cost producer, so it obviously was in our interest to, join the GATT process and force down tariffs as far as we could. And then eventually, now we're not the low-cost producers, so hey-ho, there's a reaction against it. But going back to Smith, as I said, obviously when I started the book, I didn't realize Trump was sort of a bit of a protectionist in his first term, but it wasn't sort of Liberation Day, full-on attempted autarky or whatever of his second term. So that doesn't really feature very prominently in the book, because I wrote it before, obviously, Trump was re-elected. But it's just another example of one of these issues in capitalism, which you would think is very current, the trade crisis, tariffs, etc. And it goes back not to the beginning of the system, but even predates the sort of industrial capitalism. And as I was researching the book, I found, you can list them all the sort of, I wouldn't say all, there are some new, as I said, some newer issues, although even in the I said global warming would cast, and climate change would class as a new one, but actually it's basically a product of pollution. And even in the early 19th century, when the factories were being built, there was a big environmental movement growing up in the US, actually, with the transcendentalists, etc. And so even that problem of capitalism can be dated back to the system's beginnings. So I thought, the more I did it, I thought, there is a book here. I can tell the whole story through these sort of themes running through it. But who wants to read a book on themes? Maybe some people do. There are people who are interested in intellectual history. But I've learned over 30 years at the New Yorker that if you want people to read, you better put some people in the story. So I tried to turn it in. The trick of the book, if it works or if it doesn't work, is I tried to turn it into a narrative by the conceit of the book is that it's a history of capitalism told through the eyes of its critics. And there are 28 chapters. Some of the chapters have got two people, so there may be about 30 critics. And I guess if you count the Luddites, there were tens of thousands of them, so there may be tens of thousands of critics. But there are about 30 of the main ones, some known, some unknown. And the challenge in writing the book was to find people who were known and unknown. There are certain people, in a book about capitalism, a history of, there are certain sort of tent posts who you can't really avoid, even if you want to. So Adam Smith is in here, Marx and Engels are in here, Keynes is in here, Milton Friedman and Hayek are in here as critics of Keynesian capitalism in the sort of 60s, 30s, in Hayek's case, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, mid-20th century. But if you want to read about these sort of, the great figures of a history of economics, they are in there. But I try to supplement them with a lot of people who are nothing like as well known, and some people who used to be very well known but are not well known anymore, like Henry George, who wrote the best-selling non-fiction book of the 19th century, apart from the Bible, Progress and Poverty. And it actually outsold the Bible, I think, for a decade after it came out in 1870. It was an astonishing transatlantic bestseller and turned him into a massive celebrity. But you very rarely hear about him now. And he had some very interesting thoughts. Veblen, Karl Polanyi has had a bit of a comeback, the Austrian. I'll get onto him in the Q&A section. Joan Robinson, the British post-Keynesian, who was a big enemy or a big critic of the Cold War, and sort of what she saw as sort of military Keynesianism. Silvia Federici, who founded the Wages for Housework movement in New York in the 1970s, about domestic labor, unpaid domestic labor. The argument was that capitalism can't survive without domestic labor, which is clearly true, because if the breadwinner of the family is going out, who's producing and raising the next generation of workers? That was her point. So there are lots of people in here, as I said, who I didn't really know much about, but I try to weave them together and tell the story from start to finish. It starts out as a sort of very transatlantic story, because that's where capitalism started out, in the UK, and then switches to the US and then to Germany. So it is a bit of a Eurocentric book to begin with. But the second half of it sort of follows the arc of capitalism, or industrial capitalism, and it does spread out into the rest of the world in the second half of the book. So I have a chapter on Nikolai Kondratiev, who was in Russia during the revolution and ended up getting executed by Stalin. I have a chapter on J.C. Kumarappa, who was Gandhi's economic advisor and set up his sort of village industries association, and was a big figure in the colonial movement and the debates about what India should do when it went post-colonial. I also moved to Latin America and covered the dependency theorists in the 60s and 70s, who were very critical of capitalism and argued that developing countries, I mean, Latin America is a bit of a strange case because a lot of those countries became independent a century ago, but in economic terms, they were still pretty much stuck in developing country status. And his explanation for that was they would be basically being exploited by, the dependency theorists' explanation was that they were being exploited by the core. So, i.e. Britain, the US, and Germany, etc. So it spreads out to there. And then, obviously, when you get into the modern era, I have a chapter on globalization. The last third of the book is really the book I sort of originally set out to write, or thought I'd set out to write, the sort of rise and fall of neoliberalism and globalization. And that obviously has got a global perspective and brings us up to the current day. And the penultimate chapter is on Thomas Piketty, who, a decade ago had a book, I think it was even thicker than this. It was about that thick, wasn't it? Which made its way into the New York bestseller list. So Piketty's my inspiration, even in commercial terms. But anyway, again, a name was, and that's a way to tell the story of rising inequality globally. And then I finish, the final chapter is on, is entitled The End of Capitalism or A New Beginning. And that's really the aftermath of the great financial crisis and the period, last 15 years, really. And the first part of it is the sort of catastrophist view that capitalism is, on its last legs again, and it's sort of disgraced itself to such a degree that even its defenders couldn't really defend bailing out the bankers. And there were some leftists, particularly in Europe, who made the argument that a German called Wolfgang Streeck, that capitalism was actually going to collapse, that he said, okay, people have said this before, but this time it's really going to happen. So I lay out those critiques, and then, of course, we come into the sort of modern era, the even last 10 years, and the rise of Trump and AI, and I actually end on sort of discussion of is there an alternative economic model for this new world in which we're in, with right-wing populism on one side, Chinese state capitalism on another, and the sort of old center-left, and the degrowth movement also on the left, very popular among young people, particularly in Europe. And then the sort of center-left, which I grew up in and Jared grew up in, sort of stuck, trying to find a sort of model which we can sell to the public. You see that in, obviously, Biden's demise, but also in demise of the European old social democratic parties. They call socialist parties, but they were basically democratic parties. in Germany and in France, and even in Britain, where the Labour Party just replaced the Conservative Party, which is a terrible government for 14 years, but the Labour Party is now even more unpopular than them. And, you know, the opinion polls have it at sort of 25%, and the most popular party in Britain at the moment is the Trumpist Reform Party. So that's the sort of arc of the thing. As I said, it's sort of soup to nuts from start to finish, but told through the eyes of you know, there are biographies. Some of the people in here are just sort of boring wonks. I mean, you know, who are sort of professors, but I've tried to keep them at a minimum. I've tried to pick people who actually played a role in public life, etc. I mean, 2 of the people in the book ended up dead for their beliefs. So, you know, not all of them did, but Kondratiev, the Russian, died in a Stalinist prison camp, and obviously Rosa Luxemburg was killed by the sort of fascist militia at the end of the German Revolution, or during the German Revolution after World War I. So, you know, it's not all just ideas, but it's told through the people are a sort of mechanism and a vehicle to tell the larger story. So that's how it hangs together. Hopefully, maybe you don't think it does hang together. The critics so far have been reasonably friendly about it, so that's good. As a writer, I mean, I'm sort of a British journalist, news journalist. That's what I started off as. But I was also a defrocked academic. I sort of went to too many universities when I was very young: Oxford, Harvard, NYU, New School, Columbia. So I've got a bit, you know, I have got sort of economic training. And then my third leg is sort of, I've been at the New Yorker for 30 years, and they basically taught me to write. So it's a sort of, the book tries to blend, it's a blend of economic analysis, sort of reportage through history, and hopefully some readable writing. And that's what it is. So having explained what it is, I'm going to go on to the Q&A, and here I have to open my notebook because Jared's going to make an appearance virtually. So, John, you've written this doorstep of a book. He actually said he enjoyed it. But the first thing I want to ask you, having ploughed back to year dot, is, was Marx wrong? Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, which features prominently in the first part of the book, famously said, you know, capitalism creates its own grave diggers, and the system is going to collapse. So we're getting on for the second, I remember the 150th anniversary, the 175th anniversary. We're going to have the 200th anniversary of that before too long. So Jared's question was, were Marx and Engels wrong, or will capitalism eventually collapse? And my answer was, well, they were certainly incredibly sort of short-sighted, thinking that it was going to collapse immediately. But there was also a bit of a PR in their pronouncements. If you actually go and read the correspondence between Marx and Engels, which I did, which is incredibly, really entertaining. It's published in like 23 volumes. I wouldn't suggest you read it all, but you can delve in here and there. They basically, when they lived in separate cities for most of their lives, so they corresponded by letter. All those letters somehow survived and have been collected. So in their letters, you see them talking to each other very personally, and they're much less sort of certain about the collapse of capitalism in their letters than they are in their published writings. So you see, for example, in 1857, when there was a big financial crisis, which started off in New York, actually, and then spread across the Atlantic, and banks failed in Glasgow, Liverpool, London. It was, you know, as I said, financial crisis is nothing new. And Engels writes to Marx something I think I quoted in the book. Now we have a chance. And, you know, and Marx writes back, yes, great. It's not just in New York. It's now spreading to Bremen. And even in Germany, there's problems. And they're very, you know, upbeat about it. Marx at that time was a journalist and wrote for the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley's newspaper, and actually wrote some sort of pieces about this, you know, about the spreading crisis. He didn't expound his catastrophist views in it, but it was actually good journalism. But anyway, and then you fast forward a sort of month or two, and things are more downbeat. You know, it's like, oh, bloody system seems to have, survived again. The government stepped in. And it's actually very, very telling, because what happened was, on both sides of the Atlantic, there weren't really central banks there, but there was a Bank of England and a Bank of America. And basically they were the authorities, although they were privatized. But they stepped in to stop the panic by basically issuing more money and sort of giving a sort of what today would be called a sort of, it's not a federal bailout, but emergency lending facilities. They stepped in and provided liquidity to the banks. And the banks, of course, once they could borrow, they could then reopen. And the crisis, it was a crisis of confidence. It's just like in the 1930s, when you have a crisis of confidence, everybody ran to get their money out. So the banking system, it was inherently fragile. But the government, as it was at the time, stepped in and basically saved capitalism. And getting back to Jared's question, were Marx and Engels wrong? I think, yes, the thing they were most wrong about was they didn't see how government, which at the time was seen as a sort of largely as a sort of feudal oligarchy, would come to be a crucial sort of supportive mechanism for capitalism. Capitalism and the government sort of have been joined at the hip since the mid-late 19th century. And it was sort of formalized in, the Federal Reserve Act here, obviously, in 1913, and then Keynesian economics comes along in the mid-30s, and suddenly we found a way to stop recessions through Keynesian stimulus policies. So, and also we have the social insurance programs starting out in Bismarck in the in 1870s, early and 1880s in Germany. Bismarck was a very conservative person. He didn't introduce it because he, loved workers' movements, quite the opposite. He thought there was a danger of sort of socialist revolution, and the German unions were coming very strong. The SPD had been founded. This was a way to wean the working classes off sort of socialist revolution by providing them with healthcare and education, etc. And that was the sort of start of the welfare state and the sort of social insurance system. So if you have the government can sort of prop up the economy when capitalist economy gets into crisis, and at the same time, it's sort of helping out the workers and making sure they don't starve. That's a sort of recipe for, turning the gravediggers into, if not people who support capitalism, certainly people who are more willing to put up with it. And that's the great problem the left has had sort of over the decades and over even the centuries. Even now, if you want to set up a left-wing movement, historically, it was always worker-based, union-based. Now, a lot of the unions leaders still support the Labour Party in England and the SPD in Germany and Democratic Party in the US, but all too many of the union rank and file and workers who aren't in unions now support right-wing populists. So that's jumping ahead to how do we sort of resurrect some sort of left-wing social or centre-left social bargain. So Marx and Engels, yes, they were wrong, but some of the problems that they saw are still very much there, and so they weren't wrong in that sense. Now, Jared's second question was the other great theme running through the last 100 years is sort of democracy and capitalism. Do you think, he asked me, that capitalism and democracy are ultimately viable in the same system? Are they ultimately compatible? Now, when I was growing up, that question would never have been asked, really. I'm a product of the sort of British post-war welfare state. I'm a scholarship boy. I had a free education, free healthcare in the National Health Service. That was all a product of democracy. The Labour government in the post-war era set that up because they were voted into office. They had a massive public support. The Conservatives just didn't think they had to go along with it because the public was so supportive coming out of the war. It was a sort of reward for heroes, all the soldiers and their families who'd fought Hitler for 6 years. It was just unthinkable to argue that they didn't deserve healthcare and didn't deserve education, etc. So that was the basis. That was democracy creating a new form of sort of what I call in the book managed capitalism. Other people call it Keynesianism, other people call it social democracy, whatever you want to call it. It's basically a mixed economy where you have still private enterprise. It's ultimately a capitalist economy. Most of the economy is still in private hands. In Britain, the Labour government did nationalise some parts of the industries, but they were failing industries which were being outcompeted. And eventually Mrs. Thatcher sold them off. But most of the economy is still, a capitalist economy run by the profit motive. But you also have a very large government sector. People say America hasn't got a big government. That's nonsense. The federal government is, small, very small compared to the Europe. But if you add the federal government, state governments, and local governments together, you get up to close to 40% of GDP. And in Europe, it's 50%. Some places getting up to 60%. So we live in a mixed economy. All the debates are within a sort of managed capitalism. It's a question of how big is that government going to be versus how small. And as an aside, as I was writing down a cellar today, I saw Josh Hawley's got a piece in the New York Times defending Medicaid, against what he calls corporate Republicans. So even the Republican Party now it's starting to recast itself, or trying to recast itself as a working class party, is rapidly coming to the realization that you can't be a working class party and then take away all the working class's social insurance benefits. So whatever happens, I don't think Trump will end up dismantling Medicaid and Social Security. It'll just be, he realizes that. Now, Mike Johnson and people don't realize it. The sort of American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation don't realize it, but, they're basically representing, they're bought and paid for, they're representing large corporations who obviously want smaller taxes. But that's getting a bit of a side. But it does go to my point. The reason capitalism and democracy have succeeded is because democracy has, over the decades or over the centuries, sort of put guardrails around capitalism. Now, the counter-argument to that, which is one of my critics, Karl Polanyi, made in the 1930s, was that all sounds very well, and it may work well for a while, but ultimately it's not viable. He argued that the only long-term solutions to sort of these capitalism and democracy is either to get rid of democracy through fascism or to get rid of capitalism and introduce socialism. So he wrote a famous article, fascism or socialism. Now, he had a very jaundiced view because he'd just been he just escaped from Vienna and when the fascists took over there, where he was a newspaper journalist. So if you're in the 1930s, it did look as if sort of capitalism and democracy had failed. Fortunately, Keynesianism came along, and in form of the New Deal in the US and in the form of the Labour government in the UK, which a lot of European support copied, and the Japanese followed a very similar, if somewhat different model. So there was this system which worked for 40 or 50 years. The French call it les 30 glorieux, the 30 glorious years. Economists call it the golden age, from sort of 1945 to 1975, when there seemed to be broad-based prosperity. Then we have the inflationary crisis of the 1970s, and my two right-wing critics of capitalism, Hayek and Milton Friedman, come back to the fore and make the argument for going back in, slashing the government, going back in favor of free markets, etc. And that carries the day intellectually, and the public thinks that Keynesianism has failed because we have two oil price shocks and inflation, etc. Very similar to what happened to Biden in the last few years. Inflation is a killer of governments. And so neoliberalism, we have the great neoliberal experiment. But again, going back to Marx, the sort of inner contradictions of that model then re-emerge in the form of massive inequality, wage stagnation in the US and and the UK and the sort of old industrial economies, which eventually produces a backlash in the form of, on the left, Bernie Sanders, and on the right, Donald Trump, because of various things we won't get into here. Trump is more successful in sort of mobilizing the mass of the working class in America and in the industrial regions. And, he comes to power. So, again, is democracy compatible with capitalism? I think it is, but there's always a danger of this sort of populist lurch towards fascism or authoritarianism or whatever you want to call it. And that's what we're seeing again today. So Polanyi, who when I was a student was sort of seen as a sort of vague historical figure, and now students of sort of political economy, he's sort of the great man again, because these sort of theories of capitalist instability, he called it the double movement, are very much back in vogue because, we're living very scary times, right? And it does seem that the sort of lurch to the right has momentum. So that was my answer to Jared. He then went on to baseball, and I'll finish with this one. He said, look, there's too many people in this book. Let me give you the Bernstein typology. You've got 30 of them. Here's how I see it. You've got critics of baseball. Some of them are critics of baseball. What did he mean by that? Well, they love baseball, but they think there's something wrong with the sport. There's too much money, the strike zone's too big, the games are too long, whatever. It needs reforming, but we love the sport. So he said, some of your critics are like that, aren't they? And I said, okay, go on. What are the other ones? He said, well, the other ones, they're the critics of zoos. I said, what do you mean? He said, I just drove past the zoo coming up here. He said, they believe zoos are inherently cruel and it's completely inhuman to lock animals up, so we should abolish zoos. They don't want to reform it, they want to abolish it. So your book is basically about critics of baseball and critics of zoos. And I thought about it. I thought, actually that's very clever, Jared, because it is. Some of the people in the book are revolutionaries. Marx and Engels were revolutionaries. Even William Thompson and the early socialists believed in displacing, the English socialists, believed in getting rid of sort of industrial capitalism, which was growing at the time, and replacing it with sort of social cooperatives, cooperative communities. They set up, the most famous one, of course, is New Harmony in Indiana, which was obviously, set up by Robert Owen, the Welshman, who was a big friend of William Thompson, who is one of my figures. But even going through further on for that, as I said, going on through Rosa Luxemburg, and Lenin is also in the book. And some of the left-wing critics towards the end, Paul Sweezy, who is the last sort of, not the last, but one of the sort of most prominent American economic Marxist of the late 20th century. I have a chapter on him. In Jared's terminology, he's a critic of zoos. He didn't think the system could be saved. Where do I line up in that? I'm in the critics of baseball camp. I mean, when I was very young, I was more on the sort of far left, although I was never extreme left. But and then anyone who lived through the sort of demise of as I did and reported on the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet model, I think you have to take that into account. So I think even today there are very few people. I've not come across them. Maybe there are some, but I do talk to a lot of people who still support the sort of centralized planned economy model, which for decades was. You could point to it and say, well, that's working pretty well. Russia used to be an agricultural economy, and now, this is in the 50s and 60s, now it's catching up. And according to the CIA, we now know the figures were all cooked, where the CIA said it was racing ahead. That model is now gone. Even the Chinese have abandoned it and adopted a sort of state capitalism model. So as far as I can see, we're now in a situation where it's all about, the debates are basically about how you manage capitalism. It seems to me the system is, in some form or another, is going to survive for the foreseeable future. I don't at all rule out that it could ultimately collapse, but for the foreseeable future, it seems to be here. So the question is, how do we manage it? And I end up with sort of, Jared said you have to write another book about that, how it works. So there are some suggestions in the last chapter, but I basically set out the models which are on offer. Starting out, as I said, with the sort of Chinese state capitalism, which seems to have been remarkably successful for 30 or 40 years in China. Now, maybe some people argue it's running into constraints now, other people don't. But it's a model that's out there, and a lot of people in the global south look at it and say, well, maybe we should follow that. Then on the other extreme, there is the degrowth movement, which, as I said, is very sort of radical environmentalism, which is very popular among generations, one or two generations below me. I have teenage daughters, and I think people in that generation tend to frame their view of economics isn't through a sort of class system or sort of the free market model if you're on the right. It's through the planet's burning, as Greta Thunberg famously said it. How can you be talking about eternal growth when the planet's burning? So everything is sort of subsidiary to that. Degrowth is a sort of outgrowth of that. We have to radically reconstruct the economy, prioritizing, reducing carbon emissions above all. If that means deprioritizing GDP growth, if that means deprioritizing wage and sort of growth and attacking consumerism, they're all on board for it. So that is the sort of vision. It's a clear vision. I've got some critiques of it, but it is a pretty clear vision. That's out there on the left. And then there are sort of the two a bit more center ground ones, and that's the Trump vision, which is basically economic nationalism redux, with tariffs to try and draw companies back to the US, massive, very tight immigration controls. They're the two basics of the model. And economically, you can make strong arguments against both of them. But politically, it's a pretty potent message to the old working class that we're going to force the corporations to come back and employ you, and we're going to keep out the foreigners so they don't take your jobs. Trump has got some sort of animal brain, which he saw that a long time ago as a very potent political message, and he's ridden it to the White House twice. Lots of other people, Nigel Farage in the UK is now trying to repeat the trick there, the AfD in Germany and the National Front in France. So whatever you think of it economically, I think it's largely an illiterate economic model. It's a formidable sort of political economy model. And then what's on the center left? And that's the big question, I think. What is the sort of new managed capitalism, the sort of new democratic social bargain for the 21st century? Now, we know some elements of it because they're the old elements. Full employment, which helps keep up wages, a stronger labor movement, which also helps keep up wages, a large and expansive safety net, which helps the people who fall. There are always going to be people who fall below, props them up, and some sort of, this is where it gets very tricky, then some sort of solution to the problems of the sort of 21st century, unaffordable housing, unaffordable education, and two more, which are even more sort of existential, AI and the threat that poses, potential threat that poses to, not just blue-collar employment, but white-collar employment. I've just been speaking to a lot of professors up at Harvard and MIT about that. And when I spoke to them 5 years ago, they were relatively optimistic, saying, oh no, this is a great technology. It's just going to make people more productive. It'll help wages go up. You've got to think of it in terms of the steam engine or the automobile. It's going to be an engine for growth. Now, when you talk to them, they have much darker views, and the way it's been developed and the way it's been sort of driven by the profit motive with no government involvement at all, it seems like rather than being developed as a sort of complement to human labor, it's been developed as a substitute for human labor, especially cognitive labor. So, we could have an AI shock, which would be, would do to the sort of cognitive workers what the China shock did to manual and factory workers. We've got that on the horizon. And then also, of course, the question that the degrowth has raised: how are we going to deal with the climate change and the burning planet? Now, those last two questions, I think, can only be tackled on a global level, which is one of the problems, makes it very difficult. They're all very difficult questions, and that's when people say to me, why are the Democrats so useless, or why is Labour so useless? I say, well, partly it's because they're useless, but really, these are very difficult questions to handle sort of democratically in a sort of inclusive way. And I don't think anybody has come out. I lay out some ideas in my final chapter, but I don't think anybody has come out with, there's not been a Keynes yet to come along and say, this is what we do. Hopefully we'll get one in the next, soon. So that's about it from me and from Jared in absentia. Sorry, I've run over a bit, but let's have some questions, and please come up to the microphone.
I guess I have a very basic question of definitions. You're using the word capitalism in all kinds of political and economic contexts and all kinds of policy things. I understand that. I follow all that stuff. But what are the criteria you look at to say this is capitalism of some form and this is not?
Yeah, it's a very good question.
What are the 2 or 3 things you look for to say this is some form of capitalism?
Well, as I said in the opening, capitalism in various forms, goes back to year dot, obviously. I think what I follow the definition of a German theorist, and he basically, the argument is it's got to be the profit motive. If it's a not-for-profit corporation, that's not capitalism. So the profit motive also is the central thing. You have to have private ownership of the means of production, to go back to the Marxian definition. That if it's publicly owned, it's not capitalism. And then thirdly, to sort of distinguish it from small-scale petty capitalism, petty bourgeois capitalism, as Marx called it, has to be production on a large scale. So large-scale production for the profit motive is basically my definition of capitalism. Now, production there doesn't just mean producing cars, because 70% of the economy is now the service sector. So it means large-scale service industries as well, run by the profit motive. Now, there's smaller capitalism. This is a capitalist bookstore, and it's a very different type of capitalism to Tesla or whatever. So there are varieties of capitalism, but I still think it's a useful concept, and there are some commonalities: relying on markets, price signals, relying on private ownership, and relying on the profit motive. They would be my 3 definitions.
Does rule of law have a role?
Rule of law. I mean, you can't have capitalism without rule of law. I mean, there has to be. That's the sort of utopianism of the ultra-free marketeers. They sort of argue that it's a natural system. You cannot have capitalism unless you have a guarantee of property rights. I mean, John Locke mentioned it. It goes back to Locke and the Enlightenment. It's an absolute prerequisite for the, you have to have property enforced by the rule of law. So the government, in that sense, is prior to the system.
Democratic capitalism is making a pathetic attempt at tackling climate change.
Yep.
But it doesn't seem to me inherent to a democratic capitalist system that it is bound to fail in this context.
Right.
There are obvious, powerful tools that could and should be deployed in a democratic capitalist system, starting with internalizing the external cost of greenhouse gas emissions, which we're doing a pathetic job of, which the US is doing nothing about whatsoever. Sure. And, so I'm still optimistic that given some more far-sighted politicians and people willing to confront the issue, put it on the table, give people the facts, persuade them that the system can adapt to this challenge.
Right.
Do you feel likewise?
I have to say I'm more pessimistic than you, having sort of written about it, going back to the first days of the sort of carbon trading schemes, etc. I think you're right. It's not an intellectual problem. We know what to do. You have to reduce carbon emissions. It's pretty straightforward. And the various mechanisms you can use. Mm-hmm. It's a political economy question. There have been a lot of well-meaning politicians, going back to Al Gore, for example, who've tried to do something about it. And nobody has cracked the nut, I don't think, of how you explain. You said we can explain it to people. I mean, let's take the Biden administration, for example. A decision was taken in the Democratic Party, I would say probably in the early Obama administration, that cap and trade wasn't politically feasible. So what do we do? So the alternative is to use subsidies and tax things. So we had the first round under Obama, but much smaller, and then we had a much bigger round under Biden. And in their own, judged by their own metrics, they were actually pretty successful. If you look at on the manufacturing side, if you just look at the number of new factories that were built, they've had no impact on carbon emissions yet. But in setting up a sort of more green economy, switching the car industry to green production, they would, you just look at the overall construction figures. There was a bigger boom in the Biden years than there's been, since the 1960s. All the foreign companies coming in and starting to build EV factories and battery factories. Now, what reward did he get for that? He got absolutely zero. Nobody gave a damn about it. All people cared about was inflation. It was very, very difficult to sell politically, and that was a very moderate, very enlightened policy. And now Trump's dismantling it bit by bit, although he can't dismantle it all because a lot of these factories. Maybe Biden's mistake was he put the factories in the red states, so they were never going to vote for him anyway. So the people who are now defending these factories are Republican congressmen and Republicans, even a few Republican senators, because they realized that a lot of these policies were actually doing well for their constituents. So, but nobody's actually produced a political coalition to really tackle it. My feeling is, I'm afraid, we're more likely to do it after there's I think it'll be a sort of Great Depression type deal, when there's a catastrophe, and some catastrophe somewhere, people realize there's absolutely no choice, then the political system will come out.
Thanks.
Now,
I have to confess that I totally admire your presentation. First of all, because it's not a welcome speech in Washington, D.C. You could get a lot more consulting jobs if you change around the things that you have been saying.
right.
And I would go a bit further to provoke the participants and saying that, unfortunately, the U.S. Academy tends to be very unilateral. So your views
Yeah.
will not be welcome in any universities,
No.
okay? I mean, even before Trump, and now it's even worse. So,
Can you finish with a question?
yeah, my question is the following. What is the challenge that intellectuals in, let's say, in academic or not,
Right.
because not all intellectuals are
Right.
in universities. So what's the role of the intellectuals in this circumstance?
Right.
What can we do?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Obviously, there are sort of two views on that. There is the sort of Keynes' view himself that ideas and intellectuals are the most important people in the world, and his famous quote about, even the sort of craziest madman in power is a slave to some defunct economist who he doesn't even know. Now, Keynes himself, of course, was an intellectual, so he liked to look at himself as the most important person around, and turned out in his case he was. But I'm a bit more skeptical now. I think intellectual ideas are important, but I don't think, I'm a bit more materialist than Keynes was. I think the sort of material conditions have to be in place before anybody is going to take any notice of any theories. So in that you say, oh, that sounds very Marxist. But actually, it's not Marxist. It is Marxist in a way. But Milton Friedman, when I interviewed him 30 years ago before he died, long time before he died, and I was interviewing him about the state of economics, and I asked him that question, and I said, what's the role of intellectuals in the economy and in sort of policy making? And Friedman had a very interesting life arc in that he was cast out in the wilderness himself for his first 20 or 30 years of his academic career from the 1940s to the mid-60s. And then when Keynesianism had its inflation crisis, he was stood there in the wings with his alternative model, monetarism, which, conquered the world. So to answer your question, I think the role of intellectuals, as Milton Friedman said, is to keep ideas alive until the circumstances present themselves in which they can be, they can have influence. So in my own tiny little way, that's, guess what I'm trying to do.
I think this is a pretty easy one, but we'll see. There was a lot of debate, of course, after the most recent financial bailout about what would have happened had they not bailed out financial institutions. So you could weigh in on that, your thoughts. But I was also wondering what would have happened if they hadn't bailed out the East India Company. What would have happened to the global economy?
I think that's an easier one. I think the East India Company, if they hadn't bailed that out, it would have been fine. Somebody else would have, the way things worked in those days, another company would have just taken over. They'd have given another company a monopoly. They didn't have to protect those shareholders. Now, the Chicago economists, I wrote a book on the Great Financial Crisis, so I don't want to bore you with all that. I'll give you a short answer. When I interviewed the Chicago economists, Friedman's or all his second-generation people, they made very much that argument in Great Financial Crisis. We should just say, to hell with them, let them all go bust. Citigroup goes bust, Goldman Sachs goes bust, whatever. Something else will arise in its stead. My counter to that was, well, didn't we try that in the 1930s? For 3 years, basically, we just let the financial system collapse. And I think in any modern economy, the financial system is so integral to the economy. The sort of split between finance and industry in a modern system doesn't really exist. I mean, when you're talking about private equity companies, for example, are they an industrial company or are they a financial company? So I would have loved to have just let them all go bust. I mean, I'm with the Chicago folks there, but I don't think it was a realistic option. And again, it goes back to this unfortunate thing that a lot of good policies, it's not good, it's sort of unavoidable policies, are very unpopular. So, one of the reasons Democrats are still in trouble is because people still do bail them for bailing out the bankers, even though it was George Bush who bailed them out. The second round was in the Obama administration.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, there's one more lady too. Let's move two. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for the book. I
thank you.
Bought a electronic version this morning.
Oh, thank you.
Quickly read the introduction and the globalization and the Piketty
All right. Thank you.
chapters, and they're excellent to read. In parallel with what you said and the question on democracy and capitalism, if you can talk about capitalism and war, basically. War.
Right.
The,
employment.
War.
War. Sorry. Oh,
Yes.
Imperialism. I got it.
That basically the multilateralism. The Bretton Woods and all of the post World War II. I mean, this is really much more of an issue and a risk than deciding if it's the government or a mix of government and things like that.
Sure.
And it seems to me that, certainly I'm going to continue reading your book, but what do you see as some of...
Okay, sure. I'll try to answer it. I don't have a sort of, 10-second capsule on what I think of capitalism and war, but in the book, I do tackle that historically. Historically, that has been... The leftist critics of capitalism always said it inevitably ends to war in the imperialist critique. And I actually have two people in the book John Hobson, the British liberal in the late 19th century, who wrote the original book on imperialism and capitalism. It's called Imperialism and Theory, which actually Luxemburg and Lenin then quoted in their more famous books on Lenin's book on, you know, imperialism as the higher stage of capitalism, quotes Hobson. So I actually think Hobson's a better book, so I concentrated more on him. Anyway, the argument made then was that capitalism inevitably leads to war because it's so unequal. Money piles up at one end of the spectrum. The rich don't tend to buy as much. In those days, now the rich, you know, account for like 50% of consumption. But in those days, rich people tended to save money. So there was this incipient overproduction problem. We're having massive productivity gains in the late 19th century. The factory economies were growing up everywhere. How are we going to sell all the stuff was a huge, huge issue. And Hobson basically made the argument that they sell it through imperialism. You go abroad to create new markets, it works as sort of sources of raw materials, but also creating new markets. The capitalism is inevitably an expansionary system. It can't survive in one sort of place because it sort of outgrows it, has to keep growing. That's inevitably going to lead to war. And then, of course, you know, Luxemburg and Lenin, during the First World War, they said, well, you know, Hobson's been proved right. You know, this is a war of imperialism. The two great imperialist powers, Britain and Germany, who were competing for Africa in the scramble for Africa, etc., and the French, and, you know, all the European imperialists are fighting with each other. It's proved the theory. Capitalism and imperialism are inevitable. So it looked like they were right. Then we had sort of 30 years of chaos, sort of, you know, disaster, not chaos, catastrophe, the interwar period. But the capitalist economies did somehow, in the post-war era, and I'm going to the question here, create a sort of peaceful, expansionary capitalist system based on the Bretton Woods system, going back to Keynes. That was sort of in Harry Dexter White. You know, my hotel is right next to the IMF and the World Bank. Created those institutions and had a system for sort of managing capitalism on a global basis based on fixed but flexible exchange rates, capital controls so the bankers don't blow everything up, and open trade, reducing tariff barriers so everybody can grow together. And that seemed to work great for, you know, 30 or 40 years. But in the crisis of Keynesianism, it sort of started to get into big trouble. And then in the 90s, it was sort of amped up on an even bigger scale when China and India joined the world economy. And we had China joins the WTO, and then we have the China shock. And it turns out that maybe, you know, it's not stable. Suddenly China is a threat to the US. So that raises the question, back to the author. It seemed like we'd solved this problem. Capitalism and doesn't inevitably have to be involved with war. Although the critics in the third world, and what used to be called the third world, the global south, a lot of them would say, well, there's still been wars throughout the global south. But let's abstract from that and stipulate that that's true. The great powers. The question of, can the great capitalist powers coexist? That's the question of the moment, right? Because the two great capitalist powers now are, you know, the Wall Street capitalist US and state capitalist China. And you'd have to say, based on the last few years and the sort of bipartisan consensus in Washington that there should be a sort of new Cold War against the Chinese, that things are not heading in a healthy direction. So again, it's just to bring it back to my book, it's one of these questions which seem to have been settled and then has come back in sort of spades. And they're just, in fact, it's the sort of classic example, I guess. So that's how I'd answer it. Last question.
Yes, so I'm not super knowledgeable on geopolitical, sociological issues, but I wanted to tie into that first question where you talked about the lunge towards the right and how populist parties in capitalist democracies are going towards that direction, right? And we see it in Germany, we're seeing it in France, in Canada, et cetera. And I'm just wondering how you distinguish between the US and other democracies that are experiencing this right-leaning tendency. So how do their differences in economies influence, I guess, how far right they're willing to go? These countries that do crack down on monopolies and aggressive for-profit industries, that do have a more socialist state, but that are not democracies in the capitalist sense that we know it here, but that are still going through this phase?
I mean, I see it as a common movement. I think there are enough commonalities in sort of right-wing economic nationalism and populism that it is a common movement across all countries. Now, that doesn't mean that individual countries, obviously, countries are products of their history, their geography, their sociological and racial makeup. So you'd expect things to be different. But that's not you either. Go back to the 30s and 20s. There were different forms of fascism, right? National Socialism wasn't the same as Franco. Franco wasn't the same as Mussolini, you know. And go down to Latin America, Paraguay, Stroessner, etc. There've always been varieties of these isms. But I think there are enough commonalities that you know, we should consider them together. I think a lot of them. I mean, I think Trump is in the vanguard, obviously, and is he as extreme as you know, some of the European right-wing nationalists? Probably not, but it's hard to say. I mean, you know, he's a lot more extreme in this term than he was in last term, right? So my feeling with Trump is he'll push it as far as he can. He's a chancer. And, you know, if people don't stand up to him, if the courts don't stand up to him, if the people ultimately don't stand up to him, he'll just keep pushing and keep pushing. He's definitely got authoritarian instincts. Whether he's got a well-worked-out system in his head, I kind of doubt. But, you know, he just keeps pushing and keeps pushing, you know. And now he's got a nice new jet to go along with it. Okay, I think that's it.
All right, thank you.